A foreign president is taken, not arrested at home, not extradited, taken, no trial, no negotiation, no consent. One moment he governs a country, the next he is inside the US legal system. That is not a headline. That is a rupture. Because when the United States captures a sitting leader like Nicolás Maduro, this is not just about Venezuela. It is about power and rules, and what happens when power decides the rules are optional. This has happened before in 1989 with Manuel Noriega. Same logic, same justification, different decade. Washington said it was self-defense, said it was law enforcement, said it was democracy. But here is the hook you cannot ignore. Once a superpower treats foreign leaders as criminals to be seized, not sovereigns to be negotiated with, international law does not bend. It cracks. If this feels unsettling, it should, because this story is not about one man. It is about the precedent that comes next. And to understand that, we need to go back to the moment this logic first escaped its legal cage. This story is often told as a story of criminals, of bad men, of necessary force. That framing is convenient and incomplete because the real issue is not who was taken. It is how the world was asked to accept it. In both cases, the United States did something radical. It treated a foreign leader as a domestic criminal problem, then used military power to solve it. Not war, not peace, something in between. This is where the line begins to blur. Law enforcement starts to sound like self-defense. Self-defense starts to sound like regime change. The question is not whether these leaders were corrupt. The text never asks us to defend them. The question is structural. If a state can bypass extradition, ignore consent, and seize a leader abroad, then what limits remain? International law was built to slow power down, to force patience, to force process. But what happens when impatience wins? To answer that, we have to step back into the late Cold War, into a moment when doctrine quietly shifted. To understand this shift, we have to go backward, not to Venezuela, to the late 1982. The Cold War was ending. The old enemy was fading. But American power was not. For decades, US intervention followed a script: counter another superpower, balance force with force, wrap action in ideology. That script was breaking down. In Panama, the target was no longer a rival bloc. It was a single man, a ruler labeled corrupt, dangerous, embarrassing. The logic quietly changed. The problem was no longer geopolitical alignment. It was criminality at the top, thugs in high places, and that framing mattered because once a leader is defined as a criminal threat, the tools change. Courts replace diplomacy. Police logic replaces sovereignty. Force becomes procedural. In 1989, the United States sent troops into Panama, not to conquer territory, not to occupy long-term, but to remove one man. This was not framed as war. It was framed as necessity, and that moment planted something dangerous. A precedent, quiet at first, but powerful, because once you cross that line, you do not easily go back. And in the next part, we reach the first explosion, the moment law and power finally collided in public. The collision came fast, and it came violently. Late December 1989. No long debate. No international mandate. 14,000 US troops entered Panama. The mission was presented as clean, precise, almost surgical: protect American lives, restore democracy, defend the canal, capture the leader. 4 objectives, all political, all wrapped in legal language. This was the moment everything snapped into focus, because capturing a foreign leader was no longer a hypothetical. It was now an operational goal, written into military orders, and the justification mattered. This was not declared war. It was framed as self-defense, not against armies, but against drugs, corruption, instability. Crime was elevated into threat. Threat was elevated into aggression. That leap is the crisis. International law allows self-defense, but only under strict limits. Necessity, proportionality, immediacy, a full-scale invasion struggles to meet any of them. Yet the operation succeeded militarily, politically, psychologically, and success has a dangerous side effect. It normalizes the method. If this pattern feels familiar today, pause for a moment, because what followed was not retreat. It was rationalization. And in the next part, we open the black box, the legal logic that made this possible. Behind the operation was not chaos. It was paperwork. Legal memoranda, carefully worded, quietly powerful. They argued something extraordinary, that U.S. law enforcement and even U.S. armed forces could seize suspects abroad without the consent of the host state, even if international law objected. The justification was elegant and dangerous. If a foreign leader poses a threat, that threat can trigger self-defense, not metaphorical defense, legal defense. Suddenly, arrest becomes protection. Rendition becomes necessity. Force becomes lawful. This is the hidden mechanism. Political goals came first. Law followed behind, reshaped to fit them. Self-defense was no longer tied to armed attack. It expanded, stretched, absorbed crime, drugs, and instability. The language blurred on purpose. Officials spoke of narcotics as aggression, of corruption as intervention, of disorder as war. Institutions like the Organization of American States were sidelined. Consent was treated as optional. Process as inconvenient. This is where international law began to hollow out. Not loudly, quietly, because once law is used to justify power, instead of restrain it, it stops being law. And when that happens, the next crisis is never far away. The second shock came later, and it was sharper because this logic did not stay in Panama. It traveled. Once crime was framed as security, every accusation became expandable. Every threat became elastic. Drug trafficking was no longer a crime. It was described as war, as aggression, as an attack without uniforms. Words mattered here. When officials said self-defense, they no longer meant tanks crossing borders. They meant harm flowing indirectly, slowly, socially. That is a dangerous upgrade because international law is built on thresholds, clear lines, high bars, lower the bar, and force becomes easier to justify. In both cases, Noriega, then Maduro now, the United States blurred crime into attack, then treated attack as permission. This is the second crisis. Not an invasion, a normalization. Once a superpower proves it can do this and survive the backlash, others start watching, learning, adapting, and that is where the story stops being American. Because in the next part, the consequences land on ordinary people, not leaders, not lawyers. You, this is where the abstraction ends and reality begins. Because when doctrines shift, it is never presidents who feel it first. It is people. When power decides that law can be bypassed, life becomes unstable below the surface. Borders feel less real. Rules feel temporary. Protection feels conditional. If you live in a country labeled problematic, your future quietly narrows. Investment pauses. Institutions weaken. Fear becomes ambient. You are told this is about justice, about removing one bad man, but systems do not stop at one man. When force replaces process, uncertainty spreads downward into jobs, into prices, into safety. You do not vote on this logic. you inherit it. And once it is normalized, it rarely stays precise. Mistakes increase, overreach follows. This is the human cost of precedent, invisible at first, devastating later. If you have ever wondered why global politics feels harsher tied to your daily life, this is one reason, because when law stops restraining power at the top, the pressure always moves downward. And in the next part, we zoom out, because the most dangerous impact of this doctrine is not local, it is global. Once the precedent exists, it does not stay contained. Other powers notice. They study the language, they copy the logic, they wait for their moment. If one state can seize a foreign leader by calling crime self-defense, others can do the same. And they will not ask permission. This is why the global reaction matters. After Panama, most governments did not applaud. They condemned at the United Nations, at regional bodies, not because they love Noriega, but because they feared the precedent. Because today it is Washington. Tomorrow it could be Moscow or Beijing. Leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping do not see this as hypocrisy. They see it as permission. If force plus legal rhetoric works once, it can work again. With different targets, different borders, international law is not enforced by police. It survives by restraint, by mutual fear of collapse. When that restraint weakens, the system does too. And that brings us to the hardest question, not what happened, but what happens next. Because from this point forward, the future splits. From here, the future breaks into three paths. Not predictions, scenarios. First, the optimistic one, states pull back, they re-anchor self-defense to real armed attack. Extradition returns to treaties. Force returns to being exceptional. International law survives not because it is perfect, but because power remembers restraint. This path requires patience and humility, rare qualities. Second, the middle path, nothing collapses. Nothing is fixed. Great powers keep stretching the language carefully, selectively. Each action is explained as unique, exceptional, necessary. Precedents pile up quietly. The system still stands, but thinner, more brittle. Law becomes interpretation. Interpretation becomes leverage. This is the most likely future. And then there is the worst path. Every power claims the right to act first, to seize, to punish, to justify later. Crime becomes war by another name. Self-defense becomes a slogan. Borders harden. Trust evaporates. Force accelerates. International law does not explode. It erodes. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems rarely fall all at once. They decay until no one notices the moment they are gone. And that brings us to the final question, not legal, not political, moral. Here is the uncomfortable truth. International law does not survive on paper. It survives on restraint, not because leaders are virtuous, but because they fear what happens when rules collapse. The capture of a foreign leader is not just an act, it is a signal. It tells the world that power can move first and explain later, that courts can follow soldiers, that law can chase force instead of restrain it. This story was never about one man in Panama or one man in Venezuela. It is about whether rules still slow power down in a world that is impatient. Because once the strongest actors decide, that process is optional, everyone else learns the same lesson. And when that lesson spreads, the cost is paid far from conference rooms, by civilians, by borders, by time. If you want to understand the future of global order, do not watch speeches. Watch precedents. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it. These conversations matter. And if you want to go deeper, into how power rewrites rules in real time. Stay with me. This story is not over.